wind howls through the jagged peaks of the Himalayas, carrying whispers of ancient secrets that no man should ever hear. High above the cloud line, where the air is thin, and the cold bites into the very marrow of the bone, lies a world untouched by modern civilization. It is a place of blinding white snow and treacherous black ice, where one misstep means certain death for even the most experienced climber. But the elements are not the only danger lurking in these frozen wastelands. For centuries, the local people have spoken of a shadow that moves through the blizzard, a massive figure that walks on two legs and watches from the ridges. This is the domain of the Yeti, and those who trespass here often find themselves hunted by something far older and more terrifying than the mountain itself. Imagine standing on a precipice, looking out over an endless ocean of clouds, with the mighty Mount Everest looming above like a silent sentinel. The silence here is absolute and heavy, pressing against the ears until the sound of your own heartbeat becomes deafening. In this desolate landscape, the mind begins to play tricks on you, or at least that is what the skeptics say to comfort themselves. They claim that the dark shapes moving in the periphery of your vision are merely hallucinations caused by altitude sickness and oxygen deprivation. But the Sherpa guides, who have lived in the shadow of these giants for generations, know better. They know that the mountains are inhabited by a deity of destruction, a creature that guards the high passes with jealous rage. The legend of the Yeti has permeated the culture of the Himalayas for thousands of years, weaving itself into the spiritual and daily life of the region. To the Western world, it is known as the Abominable Snowman, a monster of cinema and paperback novels. However, to the people of Tibet and Nepal, the Yeti is very real and very dangerous. It is described not as a mindless beast, but as a powerful entity that straddles the line between the physical and the spiritual worlds. Elders speak of it in hushed tones around the fire, warning young herdsmen never to stray too far into the high valleys after dark. They say that to see the Yeti is an omen of death or a curse that will follow your family for generations. The first whispers of this creature reached the West in the 19th century, when British explorers began to map the formidable terrain of the Himalayas. Early reports were often dismissed as the ramblings of superstitious locals or misidentifications of the Tibetan blue bear. Yet as more expeditions ventured into the unknown, the stories began to change. Seasoned mountaineers, men of science and reason, began to report strange tracks in the snow that defied logical explanation. These footprints were huge, often measuring over 12 inches in length, and were undeniably bipedal. They appeared in remote areas where no human being could survive without extensive gear and support. Yet the tracks showed a creature walking barefoot through the freezing snow. It was in the year 1921 that the mystery gained a terrified global audience during the first reconnaissance expedition to Mount Everest, led by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Howard Berry. The team discovered deep tracks at 21,000 feet near the Lakpala Pass. The Sherpas stared at the prince in fear and whispered the words, "Meadow Kangmi." When Howard Berry recounted this to the press, the journalist Henry Newman mistranslated the Tibetan term. He translated meadow as abominable, rather than its closer meaning of man, bear, or wild man. Thus, the name Abominable Snowman was born, creating a sensationalized moniker that would haunt the headlines of newspapers across the United Kingdom and the United States for decades to come. Despite the somewhat comical name given by the press, the reality of the encounters was anything but funny for those who experienced them. In the years that followed the 1921 expedition, reports of sightings increased in frequency and intensity. Mountaineers spoke of a horrible high-pitched whistling sound that echoed through the valleys. At night, a sound that no known animal in the region could produce. Campsites were found disturbed, with heavy equipment tossed aside like toys. Some climbers reported the sensation of being followed for days, seeing a dark, upright figure, keeping pace with them on parallel ridges, always staying just out of rifle range, but close enough to instill a primal dread. The most famous piece of evidence emerged in 1951, when the distinguished mountaineer Eric Shipton took a series of photographs that would shake the scientific community while exploring the Menlung Basin. Shipton and his partner Michael Ward stumbled upon a fresh trail of footprints. The prints were massive and clearly showed a heavy heel and a broad toe structure that looked unsettlingly human. Shipton placed his ice axe beside one of the prints for scale and snapped the photo. The image of that deep, clear footprint in the hard snow remains one of the most chilling pieces of cryptozoological evidence ever recorded, suggesting a creature of immense weight and power. The Shipton photograph sparked a fervor of interest, leading to the Daily Mail expedition of 1954. This was a massive undertaking dedicated solely to finding the creature. While they did not capture a Yeti, they uncovered something perhaps more disturbing. In the remote monastery of Pangboche, the expedition team found relics that the monks claimed were the actual remains of a Yeti. These included a conical scalp with coarse reddish-black hair and a skeletal hand that looked like a grotesque distortion of a human hand. The monks guarded these relics with their lives, believing that if the artifacts were removed, protection over the valley would be lost, and disaster would befall the village. The story of the Pangboche hand took a bizarre turn, involving the American oil tycoon Tom Slick and the Hollywood actor James Stewart in a covert operation that sounds like spy fiction. Parts of the finger bone were smuggled out of Nepal to be analyzed by scientists in the West. the results were inconclusive, with some experts claiming it was near human and others dismissing it. But the visual impact of that twisted, desiccated hand remains burned into the memory of anyone who saw it. It was a tangible piece of a nightmare, a physical confirmation that something large and unknown had died in those mountains. The monks still say the spirit of the creature was angered by the theft. Let us now step away from the dry facts of history and step into the boots of a man who experienced the horror firsthand. We will call him Thomas, a seasoned climber from the United States who ventured into the Himalayas in the late 1950s. Thomas was not looking for the Yeti, he was looking for solitude and the challenge of an unclimbed peak in the Kanchenjunga region. He was a rational man, a veteran of the war, who did not believe in ghosts or monsters. He traveled with a small team of Sherpas who grew increasingly nervous as they ascended into a narrow valley, known locally as the Valley of Silence. The trouble began on the third night at high camp. The weather had turned foul with a biting wind that threatened to tear their canvas tents from the mountainside. Thomas lay awake in his sleeping bag, listening to the gale, when he heard a sound that cut through the noise of the storm. It was a guttural cry, something between a roar and a moan, that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. His Sherpa guide, named Pemba, gripped his arm terror-wide in his eyes. Pemba whispered that the guardian of the pass was angry, and that they must descend immediately at first light. Thomas dismissed it as the wind playing tricks on the rocks. The next morning, the storm had broken, leaving the world covered in a fresh blanket of pristine white snow. Thomas emerged from his tent to stretch his aching limbs and froze. Circling the entire camp was a single line of tracks. They were huge, much larger than his own double boots, and they were fresh. The tracks walked right up to the side of his tent, lingered there, and then walked away toward a sheer cliff face. There were no other tracks approaching or leaving the circle. It was as if something had materialized out of the thin air, walked around them while they slept, and then vanished into the stone. Thomas tried to rationalize what he was seeing. Perhaps a bear had wandered up from the lower valleys, but bears do not walk on two legs for such distances, and bears do not possess the intelligence to investigate a camp without looting the food stores. The food bags which had been left outside were untouched. This creature was not hungry. It was curious, or perhaps it was assessing a threat. The Sherpas were already packing their gear, their movements frantic and jerky. They refused to go any higher. Thomas, stubborn and driven by ego, argued with them, but they would not be swayed. They left him there alone with his supplies, promising to wait at the lower base camp for 3 days. Now alone in the vast whiteness, Thomas felt a heavy, oppressive isolation descend upon him. He decided to stay one more night, to prove a point, to prove that he was not afraid of local superstitions. He spent the day fortifying his tent and checking his equipment. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, casting long purple shadows across the valley, the temperature plummeted. The silence returned absolute and suffocating. Thomas sat inside his tent, clutching his ice axe, the only weapon he had. He told himself he was being ridiculous, but the feeling of being watched was so intense it made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Darkness fell completely, and the moon rose, casting a pale, ghostly light over the snow. Thomas tried to sleep, but his senses were dialed to their maximum sensitivity. Around midnight, he heard the sound of crunching snow. It was rhythmic and heavy. Crunchy, crunchy, crunchy. It was the sound of 2 feet walking with purpose. The steps were slow and deliberate. Thomas stopped breathing, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The footsteps stopped right outside the thin fabric of his tent. He could hear the heavy, wet breathing of something massive just inches away from his face. A terrible smell seeped into the tent, a stench of rotting meat, wet fur, and old musk. It was a primal odor that triggered a biological panic response in Thomas. He gripped the handle of his ice axe so hard his knuckles turned white. A large dark shadow blocked the moonlight, illuminating the tent wall. The silhouette was enormous, broad-shouldered, and lacking a neck. The creature stood there motionless for what felt like an eternity. Then a massive hand pressed against the canvas. Thomas watched in horror as the fabric stretched under the pressure of long, thick fingers. The creature dragged its hand down the side of the tent, creating a sound like rasping sandpaper. Thomas wanted to scream, but his throat was constricted with terror. He realized, with a jolt of clarity, that he was completely at the mercy of this thing. If it wanted to tear the tent open and crush him, it could do so with 0 effort. He was an intruder in its domain, a soft, fragile thing wrapped in nylon. The heavy breathing continued, deep and rattling. It sounded like the mountain itself was inhaling and exhaling. Thomas closed his eyes and prayed to a god he hadn't spoken to since the war. Suddenly, the creature let out a sharp huffing noise and turned away. The footsteps resumed crunching in the snow, moving away from the camp. Thomas did not move. He did not sleep. He sat frozen in that position until the first gray light of dawn began to illuminate the tent walls. When he finally summoned the courage to unzip the door and look outside, the camp was empty, but the evidence was there. Huge tracks circled the tent again, and where the hand had pressed against the fabric, there was a smear of greasy, dark residue that smelled of the grave. Thomas did not hesitate. He abandoned his summit attempt. He abandoned his extra gear, and he practically ran down the mountain. The descent was a blur of panic and exhaustion. Every shadow looked like a monster. Every gust of wind sounded like a roar. He felt followed. He kept glancing over his shoulder expecting to see the white beast charging at him. The terrain was treacherous, and in his haste, he slipped multiple times, nearly tumbling into the crevasses that scarred the glacier. But the fear of what was behind him was greater than the fear of the fall. As he reached a ridge overlooking the lower valley where the Sherpas were waiting, he stopped to catch his breath. He looked back up toward the high peaks one last time. There, standing on a rocky outcrop, thousands of feet above him, was a figure. It was tiny at that distance, but distinct against the sky. It stood upright, watching him leave. Thomas raised his binoculars with shaking hands. Through the lenses, he saw it clearly. It was covered in dark reddish hair, with a face that looked terrifyingly human, yet utterly feral. It threw its head back and let out a long, mournful wail that echoed down the valley. Thomas made it to the Sherpas, who looked at him with a mixture of relief and knowing pity. They did not ask what he had seen. The look in his hollow eyes told them everything they needed to know. They packed up the camp in silence and began the long trek back to civilization. Thomas never climbed in the Himalayas again. He returned to the United States, a changed man, haunted by the face he had seen through the binoculars. He spent the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, uncomfortable in open spaces and terrified of the dark. The story of Thomas is just one of hundreds of accounts that have emerged from the Himalayas over the last century, while skeptics continue to debunk the Yeti as a myth or a misidentified bear. The sheer volume and consistency of the reports are hard to ignore. From the highly respected British explorers of the 1920s to the modern trekking guides of today, the descriptions remain remarkably consistent. A bipedal creature roughly 7 to 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair, with a conical skull and a distinctively human-like face. In recent years, science has tried to solve the mystery with DNA analysis. Samples of hair and bone attributed to the Yeti have been tested by laboratories around the world. Some results have pointed to an ancient subspecies of polar bear that may have survived in the high-altitude isolation of the Himalayas. This theory suggests a bear that adapted to walk on its hind legs, more frequently explaining the tracks. However, this explanation fails to account for the behavioral aspects reported by eyewitnesses, particularly the stone throwing and the intelligent curiosity displayed by the creatures. Another compelling theory is that the Yeti is a remnant population of Gigantopithecus, a giant ape that existed alongside early humans in Asia and is thought to have gone extinct hundreds of thousands of years ago. Proponents of this theory argue that as humans expanded, these giant apes retreated into the most inhospitable and inaccessible regions of the planet to survive. The Himalayas, with their thousands of square miles of unexplored terrain, would offer the perfect sanctuary for such a species. If this is true, then we are sharing our planet with a living relic of the prehistoric past. But perhaps the scientific explanations miss the point entirely. To the Sherpa, the Yeti is not an animal to be classified in a zoo, but a spiritual guardian. It represents the raw, untamable power of nature. It is a reminder that there are still places on this earth where humans are not the masters. In a world that has been mapped satellites and conquered by technology, the idea of a hidden monster offers a strange kind of comfort. It suggests that the world is still big and mysterious and full of wonder, even if that wonder is terrifying. There are valleys in the Himalayas that no human foot has ever touched, deep gorges shrouded in perpetual mist, where the sun never fully reaches the bottom. It is in these places that the secrets are kept. The Yeti does not want to be found. It is a master of its environment, capable of vanishing into the snow and rock in the blink of an eye. The expeditions that go looking for it with noise and cameras and guns are doomed to fail. It is only the lone traveler, the silent observer, who might catch a glimpse of the shadow. The accounts of the Yeti serve as a modern ghost story, a tale of the unknown lurking just beyond the edge of the campfire light. They tap into our primal fear of the wild, of being hunted, of being alone in the dark. Whether flesh and blood or spirit and myth, the Yeti exists in the collective consciousness of humanity. It is the shadow on the mountain, the sound in the wind, the feeling of dread that washes over you when you realize you are not alone. Even today, climbers attempting the summit of Everest or K2 report strange occurrences. Gear that goes missing, strange tracks that appear overnight outside high-altitude camps, and the unshakable sensation of being watched from the ridges above. Most climbers are too focused on the summit to speak of it, openly fearing ridicule or the loss of sponsorship. But in the quiet bars of Kathmandu and the tea houses of Lukla, the stories are shared in hushed whispers over cups of chang. They speak of the creature that smells of death. They speak of the whistling that drives men mad. They speak of the glowing red eyes that reflect the moonlight. The locals leave offerings of food and incense at the base of the sacred passes, asking for safe passage and forgiveness for trespassing. They know that the mountains belong to the Yeti, and that humans are merely tolerated guests who overstay their welcome at their own peril. So if you ever find yourself in the high Himalayas, standing amidst the silent giants of rock and ice, listen closely to the wind. Look carefully at the shadows stretching across the snow, and if you see a single line of massive footprints disappearing into the mist, do not follow them. Turn back and be grateful that you were allowed to leave, for in the kingdom of the snow, the Yeti is king, and it does not take kindly to strangers who seek to uncover its secrets. The mystery remains unsolved, and perhaps it is better that way. Some doors should not be opened. Some things are meant to remain hidden in the ice. and the dark. The abominable snowman continues to walk the high ridges, a ghost of the mountains, guarding the secrets of the roof of the world. And as long as the snow falls and the wind blows, the legend will endure, a chilling reminder that we are small and the world is vast and full of monsters. As night falls once again over the peaks, the temperature drops and the world turns to ice. The climbers are in their tents, huddled for warmth. But outside, in the darkness, something is moving. It is watching. It is waiting. The Yeti is out there, and it is hungry. Sleep well, and pray that the scratching you hear on your tent is just the wind.